Hello, friends, and welcome back to C Club's podcast. My name is Jess. Very excited to be here today with my friend, Will Papper, who is a co-founder at Syndicate Protocol and also the creator, the launcher from an airport of Adventure Gold. This conversation, we dove into Loot, the game Loot, and all sorts of fun things that have sort of emerged around it. We talk about why Loot is interesting. We get into the story and the history of Adventure Gold, which is absolutely fascinating. And I think probably the most interesting part of our conversation is when Will starts talking about scarcity versus abundance mindsets as they relate to token design and economic design. I'm really fascinated with his idea around how long-term thinking and the abundance mindset truly matters when building products, and kind of hints at the fact that maybe we're not doing that so well right now. This conversation with Will is absolutely fascinating, and I'm really stoked to share it with you. But before we do, you may have noticed there was a new intro song. It was called Flower Seeds, and it was part of a fun collaboration we did with our friends at SongCap. So this is the C Club podcast official song. 30 different artists contributed potential tracks through a mini camp with our friends at SongCap. So we're very excited to have Flower Seeds be our anthem moving forward, and we want to thank everybody over at SongCamp for leading such an amazing creative exploration. All right, let's jump in it. Will Papper on Adventure Gold, Loot, Scarcity and Abundance, and Building the Future. Will, are you ready for a super serious conversation?
Yeah, let's do it. Can't even keep a straight face.
Yeah, why don't you just give us a brief introduction, and specifically, as I've led off with here, we're really interested in, you do a lot of different things out in the world, and why don't you start off with a bit of an introduction and tell us a little bit about what you're working on?
Yeah, sounds great. So I'm Will. I got into the decentralization space in 2013 when I was doing research on mesh networking technologies one summer at the MIT Media Lab. Mesh networking, another prominent peer-to-peer technology. That and BitTorrent kind of are like the ugly stepchildren of the blockchain space, I guess you could say, because they're not blockchain applications, and the decentralization space kind of got all of the air got sucked out the room by blockchain. So I was doing decentralization stuff that was not blockchain initially, and I knew about Bitcoin at that point in time and was curious about it, but didn't really have money to invest in it. So I was just hacking on side projects, things like that. And in 2013, 2014, I was, as a weekend project, trying to compile my own fork of the Bitcoin network. It was really cool for people to launch their own token where they'd fork the Bitcoin network, change the token name, change the max number of tokens, change some details about block confirmation times, and then redeploy it, and they'd find a bunch of miners to hopefully secure the network. So I was doing that as a weekend project and saw just how absurdly difficult the process was of I just wanted to make a little test token, and I'd need to find miners to secure the entire network and protect it against 51% attacks. At the time, the Ethereum presale popped up, and I saw, oh wow, you can create your own token, and it's secured by the Ethereum network. That's super cool. So I took the $10 sign-up bonus I got for signing up for Coinbase, and I tossed that into the Ethereum presale. Was overdrafting my checking account at that point in time. So I did not have much to put in, but put in $10. If I had been able to put in $100, I could have been able to buy a house, but hindsight's 2020. Yeah, so I've been tracking the Ethereum space for a long time, doing various side projects in the crypto space, and my full-time work in it started when I was working at IDEO. I was a collab fellow there, where I was basically working on R&D with them on some blockchain applications, some machine learning applications, remote work before remote work was something people were talking about. And while there, I met Ian, and Ian Lee is my co-founder at Syndicate. We've known each other for 4 years now, and we've been talking about Syndicate for the last few years in terms of pseudonymous on-chain reputation, and we decided to go make Syndicate happen in January of this year. So Syndicate is my day job, and then I launched Adventure Gold on the side. Adventure Gold is a token that is a potential in-game currency for the Loot ecosystem. I coded it in 4 hours at an airport in Bend, Oregon. There wasn't there was one shop, so I was just surviving off of prepackaged egg and cheese sandwiches, as I coded this in the airport, and then launched it live on a Clubhouse chat. And I'd say that yeah, everything that followed was just way, way, way beyond my expectations. I didn't expect it to get so much traction so quickly.
So I want to get into all of that because just like we're gonna zoom over some really important things here, which I think is interesting. But I worry that there's maybe a somewhat of a lack of context here. Well, I think most people in our space have heard of Loot before. Maybe you can just like give me like the high level overview of what Loot is, and then why is it so interesting to somebody like yourself? Obviously, you're a builder. Pretty sure you always have some sort of side hack thing that you're doing. What is Loot and why was it so interesting to somebody like yourself?
Yeah, so Loot is essentially an on-chain NFT that is the building blocks for a future RPG game. And Loot itself is lines of text of items that your character can have in this RPG. I saw the original Loot Mint, and Dom, the creator of Loot, who's the former co-founder of Vine, when I saw that he was the one who had made it, I knew that it would be very interesting because all of Dom's NFTs are completely on-chain. And most NFTs are not on-chain. So most NFTs, if you look at the data in the NFT, it points to a URL. Oftentimes that URL is a centralized server, so the NFT itself is not actually decentralized. Sometimes that URL is pointing to decentralized storage on IPFS or Arweave, which is better, but the data is not available on the Ethereum blockchain itself. DOM's NFTs are unique because all the data is available on the Ethereum blockchain, which means that any other smart contract can hook into that data and build on top of it. And that is why we've seen the explosion of creativity in Loot, because it is fully on chain. And that is extremely rare. So a lot of people, like early ridicule of Loot was people were like, it's just lines of text. Like that's where we are in the bubble. Like we went from generative art, like, yeah, I have two art blocks pieces made by Jake from CoinFund that I own that I also printed out and put up as my background. Like we went from all this art, this legitimate generative art and PFP projects to like lines of text, and that's all they are. And I'm sitting there thinking, this is not lines of text, this is on-chain data. That's very rare in the space, and that's what's really unique and really interesting. So I'd missed the original mint. I was hiking in Oregon, had no cell service, had no access to any of my crypto. When I got back, I just sold my Meebit and swept the floor for Loot that Sunday, which turned out to be, I loved my Meebit. I was sad to see it go, but it turned out to be a very good decision.
So was it purely just like it was this mixture of like on chain and DOM that made you sell your beloved Meebit and ape in, or was there like did you see sort of like because what went on to happen in that space was like Loot pumped all of a sudden it was like the talk of the town for at least a couple of weeks, and I think maybe arguably still is in certain circles. Was there something like inherent to the simplicity of it, or were you just betting on the horse here?
I so I knew that Dom's NFTs were on chain, and then I looked at the Loot contract and I saw it had like getter functions for each individual item. So like you could get the weapon, you could get the shoes that someone was wearing, and I'm like, okay, this is programmatic, this is really interesting. And yeah, that's when I decided to dive in, was looking at the contract itself. I'd heard some buzz around it, and that buzz definitely made a difference, but it was looking at the contract that made me part with my beloved Meebit to go into Loot.
Yes, there's some I don't know irony or interest there as you're like selling one metaverse, a character that's potentially could live in metaverses. At least that was the promise of it for one that is maybe like the atomic units of a potential far less visually represented metaverse. Though I guess who knows where Loot might go. There's sweetness in that.
Yeah, I didn't make that connection before. I think that, yeah, generally, like the NFTs I bet on were the NFTs I bet like decent amounts of ETH on were stuff that I thought was building blocks of the future. I used to say that I was a terrible NFT investor because I thought I was. Like, I aped into some NFTs that were totally worthless back in 2018. I had like I knew if I decided not to mint something, it would probably go up. Like I saw the Bored Ape mints, and I was like, oh, I'm not a big fan of the art style. Like all of the CryptoPunks didn't match my aesthetic taste. So like I thought I was a terrible NFT investor because my aesthetics totally did not match the rest of the space. I guess in Loot that didn't matter because there were no aesthetics.
Yeah, I love it. So okay, I mean, the the challenge I have with these conversations. There's so many threads I want to pull on, and I want to make sure we get the appropriate context out of the way first. So you floor sweep. You're excited about the on-chain data and sort of the individual items. And early on, my sense was all of a sudden, like I went to bed one night, and then all of a sudden there's this like community of thousands of people that were building on Loot and in the Discord. What did that early community formation look like, or when you came to that community, what sort of energy was there?
Yeah, and a lot of that actually is part of the inspiration for Adventure Gold. I had started working on Adventure Gold before I even had Loot, but seeing how the Loot community evolved in the first few days gave me more confidence in the direction of Adventure Gold. So early Loot was it was like just wonderful energy from builders who were launching tons of derivatives on top of it. The very first derivative was abstract loot, which leveraged the on-chain data to create generative art out of different loot bags. That was super cool because I was like, wow, like they are using the data that's on-chain in another smart contract for these generative ideas. Like already this thesis of the on-chain composability and on-chain data, that the thesis that it matters is showing to be true. And abstract loot was really cool. There were other derivatives that were really interesting, and then there were some derivatives that were not. There were some derivatives that were very cash grabby with like super high mint prices in ETH, and they would try to create some FOMO of like, oh, your loot derivative is only reserved as a loot holder for a little while, and after that it'll be a public sale, so claim now before someone else can claim your loot, your like reserved loot. And it just struck me as like, okay, there's some derivatives that are really cool, and there's some derivatives that are just trying to extract value from the community rather than contribute back to the community. And one of the first use cases I had in mind for Adventure Gold was we could permission mints using Adventure Gold. So instead of pricing mints in ETH, where it like just extracts values for the holders, what if we priced these things in Adventure Gold and started to have this in-game economy, in-game ecosystem? And there was a mint.
So, okay, we need to do some definitions here with Adventure Gold before we go on, because that context is going to be super necessary. And also there's a couple interesting stories in and around the creation of Adventure Gold that I want to make sure that we capture here. So can you just very high level, what is Adventure Gold? And then zoom us back into the prepackaged egg and cheese sandwiches in the airport in Oregon.
Yes. So Adventure Gold was an idea I had before I owned any loot. The core premise was, what if we take these NFT projects and we give them an in-game, or like effectively a social token? Let's take NFT projects and give them a social token and see what happens. Adventure Gold for loot was the very first prototype of that. So Adventure Gold was an airdrop of 10,000 AGLD tokens, A gold tokens, to every loot holder. So every single loot bag you owned earned you 10,000 A gold tokens. And this was an experiment to see what would happen when we airdrop a bunch of tokens on a community that they can then use within their own ecosystem. And part of it was motivated by the early mints of like, if you're pricing in ETH, it's not really doing anything for the community. It's not really helping build up the community. If you price it in A gold, then that helps like create like this own community social token that they can use internally, and the potential infrastructure for any future in-game currency that A gold could be adopted as. So yeah, A gold is an ERC20 that every single loot holder received. The A gold contract is flexible and supports, for example, new seasons of A gold. That is up for the A gold holders to decide. So future airdrops are technically possible. Whether they happen or not is up to the community. So there's also this additional element of governance, which I know we'll dive into, which is like, how does the community want to govern loot? How does the community want to govern A gold? And where do the interests of those groups overlap between loot, A gold, and more loot, which is like a inflationary version of loot? And where do those interests diverge? Because that got very, very interesting over the subsequent few days.
Yeah, so I think alluding to some interesting drama around this, maybe we can get some backstory, or at least your first person perspective of it. But just to catch up, so we have this NFT drop, of which people were minting the original loot NFTs from a contract. There was a big rush into it. I remember I bought one loot. I remember buying it on OpenSea after the fact. It was at maybe 0.05 ETH, but I couldn't get transactions through because the floor was being swept by so many people that were so excited by it. And that should have been my first indication of like, oh, there's something here to pay attention to. But of course, get on with the day and wake up a day or so later and all of a sudden everybody's just talking about loot. And then Adventure Gold is, if you held onto a loot, you'd be able to go and essentially mint Adventure Gold to your wallet. Each one of those NFTs sort of had a claim on 10,000 Adventure Gold. I think it's an important thing to, like, there seems to be early on, I remember some mischaracterization around the intention behind Adventure Gold. I want to get into the governance pieces there, but like, was there a pre-mine associated with it? And also, can you tell me how, like, it went from like going from not a thing to a thing with like millions of dollars, if not more, worth of liquidity, and being listed on FTX and all sorts of things very, very quickly. So can you just sort of give us a little insight into like, how did it go from you pushing like, signing a transaction all the way through to this like crazy VC / market interest?
Yeah. So I had been building up buy-in from the community over the previous few days. So I had been posting near daily updates on the progress of the contract. I was finishing up some tests. I had the community audit it. So there were a bunch of community members who reviewed the contract. One person pointed out some particularly helpful gas optimizations. So I was working with the community to get buy-in over the previous few days. And then I was on the Good Time show to talk about loot, hosted by Shriram and a number of other folks in the tech ecosystem and Jason's ecosystem. I was talking about Adventure Gold and how I was working on it. And then everyone in the loot Discord was like, is it ready? Is it ready? Is it ready? And I had like done the deployment earlier that day, but I didn't have any like mint instructions prepared. I didn't have like any documentation around it. We had done 2 test mints total, me and some friends, but everyone was asking for it, and the testing had been solid. Everything looked good. So I thought, okay, I'll launch it live on the Clubhouse call. So I just dropped the mint link for everyone as they're asking for it in the Discord. And then I just see the claim amounts go up and up and up. It's like immediately like millions of Adventure Gold are claimed, and I just keep refreshing and I see like hundreds of thousands of more are being claimed. And I was like, wow, people really want this. It's worth the cost of gas. That's cool. So yeah, the claims went crazy. And like that day, I had woken up at 5 a.m. that day because I was still kind of on like a hiking schedule of like wake up at sunrise and go to sleep at sunset. And then that day I ran support for 24 hours straight and went to sleep at 5 a.m. that day. And I don't talk about the price. I don't have any thoughts on the price. Adventure Gold is purely a in-game currency. That's how I view it. That's my only focus. Nothing more than that. I'll just say that I was the community adoption it received and the traction it received in the broader cryptocurrency communities was wildly beyond my expectations for something I wrote in 4 hours at an airport.
Yeah, so I think that was like the interesting thing. I remember, we have a C Club group chat with our collaborators, and I think Brian Flynn was in that group chat being like, Adventure Gold, this is a social token. Loot has changed the game as far as what, how communities are going to come together and build stuff. What does this mean for how we at C Club live and breathe? And, did we miss out on this? And so I went into like immediate mode of like, oh my God, what is the deal with this? Like, what is the story behind it? How did Adventure Gold launch? How did this thing just come out of nowhere? And, great that I have my claim on one of them, but like, I pride myself in being in the loop. I want to be in the loop, Will. And I felt very like kind of out of the loop. And so I started going around and I was like, saw you had said something about it. And I think I reached out to you and I'm like, Will, like, what's the deal with this? And you're like, oh, well, like I was in this airport in Oregon after a hiking trip and I kind of like just wrote this thing and now it's like that. And I was just like, honestly, it made me feel really good, Will, that I was only one step away. You're 0 degrees away from being Canadian right now, and I was just one step away from Adventure Gold. Didn't solve the problem of me being like, wow, how come I wasn't fast enough on the front wave? But anyways, it's a part of my existential dread as somebody trying to lead a project in the space. But what really blew me away was just how, the way you just tell the stories, it was just like, man, I was just nerding out over this thing and I wanted to put it out in the world. And you do have a bit of profile, right? So you're on the show within it was a fairly well listened to show, I guess, within the Clubhouse ecosystem. But more so, it was just sort of like this ravenous community of individuals that are in these discords that were just eating up. They saw the promise of this thing. It burned really, really bright, really fast. And contrasting that with just like your nonchalantness over this. I mean, the reality is that Adventure Gold launched, and I think it was like a $300 million plus market cap, probably higher than that. I know you don't want to talk about price, and so I won't hold you to that, but it was a significant valuation put on this. And even today, I think it's in around the $270 million market cap. Like, these are meaningful things. And it just, I don't know, it's just a wonderful thing to see almost like the leverage and the randomness and the scale that can kind of come from just being earnestly interested in something.
Yeah, and I think that the thing that made Adventure Gold what it was is that it was a totally fair launch. I didn't reserve any for myself. I held some loot, not a ridiculous amount of loot, enough loot to hold a good chunk of Adventure Gold, but not anywhere in the top 20 holders. And it was just something of, hey, here, this is for the community, then you can use it as you wish. And I think that one thing that I've been trying to push forward in the space, just in the way I act and the way I am in the space, is this like the 2014 to 2016 Ethereum world was like very techno-utopian. It was all these really radical experiments and human collaboration and community building. The DAO in 2016, which I put 7.5 ETH into when back then that was not very much money. The DAO being one example of like these like radically optimistic, radically utopian experiments and collaboration. And crypto goes through cycles. I'd say the 2017 to 2020 cycle was more financially motivated than like collaborative and techno-utopian. I think that DAOs and social tokens are where I see that same like collaborative and techno-utopian spirit, and that's what convinced me to go full time into the space and co-found Syndicate. With Loot and Adventure Gold, I mean, it wasn't about any sort of profit seeking for Dom. It wasn't about any sort of profit seeking for me. It's just the entire community ethos was, hey, this is cool, putting this out there, and anyone can do with it as they wish. And I'd say I got the full spectrum of what happens after you launch a project. I got people telling me that they were broken, that they have enough from the Loot ecosystem to go buy a Lamborghini. I hope that they saved it or invested it and didn't just buy a Lamborghini, but I am glad that they were able to if they wanted to. I had people message me. One particularly moving story is someone whose father had just died, and his family was Muslim, and for his father to pass on to like the afterlife, his father's debts had to be paid. And this person paid off their debt and their father's debt with the Loot ecosystem. That was just incredibly moving to me. So I got some really wonderful stories like that. And then I got the other end of the spectrum was I got death threats, I got suicide threats, I had people photoshopping me into porn. I had basically like anything you could think of. I probably received it in my DMs. Yeah, so it was very interesting seeing both sides of the community, both the really good, really heartwarming parts, and also the underbelly, I'd say, of what happens after you launch a project.
Yeah, that's absolutely wild. The internet is a weird place, a fun, crazy, scary, weird place that maybe some of us have to inhabit in a little bit more of a public way than others on occasion. So I'm glad you were able to thrive through that and the uncertainty. You know, what I witnessed around Adventure Gold, and I think actually when we talked, first of all, like I tried to get you on this podcast a couple weeks ago, and you're sort of in the midst of this sort of series of governance decisions that I think are interesting to get into. And just to sort of backtrack a bit here, one of the interesting byproducts of the way that you launched was that there wasn't an ecosystem fund, right? There wasn't like there was not some pool of capital that was sort of designed to like withheld by the Adventure Gold DAO.
Right, Adventure Gold had no specific structure built in. There was a DAO mint function that you could use to generate more Adventure Gold, and I was assuming that an ecosystem could form around the DAO mint function, but I didn't require anything in the contract related to that. There's no obligation for the community to use it.
I think that's super interesting because it's like, how do you, one of the things that we think a lot about is like, and one of my critiques of fractionalized NFTs as like a starting point for social tokens is this, the challenge of like, what is the incentive for somebody to go do things with? Where is the ongoing funding? You know, people need to be rewarded for contributing work. And it sounds like you sort of have that baked in at the contract level, assuming there's some sort of consensus around it. But like the immediate challenge was one of legitimacy and consensus building, correct? Like can you take us into like go from it launched as live to all of a sudden there's snapshot votes up and there was some sense of trying to build legitimacy and direction and cohesiveness around the project. Very curious how you navigated that.
In terms of legitimacy, so I think there's two elements to legitimacy, right? One is the community going to take this on as it's like as something that it wants to use and wants to leverage and wants to bring forward. And then there's legitimacy in terms of like, okay, well, how should this thing be used now that the community has decided to adopt it? So on the first aspect of legitimacy, which is like, does the community view this as the in-game currency ecosystem? The answer was very unambiguously yes. It was a fair launch. It was available to any loot holder to claim. It was, if I say so myself, a well-written contract that was gas efficient and secure and reviewed by the community, and all these factors. I'd been building in buy-in from the community over the past few days. So the question of like, is the community willing to accept this as the in-game currency of the loot ecosystem? The answer was very much yes. And then there was another question, which got very contentious. And this is why I'm glad we're having the conversation a few weeks later, now that we have more time to reflect on it and see how this plays out, because I was like, yes, we need the governance stuff to resolve first before we talk. All of the governance pieces are still a bit in flight, but there's a lot more clarity around them. So interestingly, I didn't have strong opinions on how Adventure Gold should be used when I launched it. I suggested a few ideas to people, and the ideas I suggested were in-game usage. So like there's various games where people are working on where you can stake like Adventure Gold to be able to battle, for example. There's I was thinking of like in-game like marketplaces, like use Adventure Gold to buy items and upgrades, kind of like any other video games internal currency. This one's actually on chain, which is a really cool feature of it. And then I also threw out the idea there of governance. And I thought, well, my thinking there was mostly loot only has 8,000 bags. To have a playable ecosystem for builders in the long term, you need something more participatory. I knew of builders who I was talking with who didn't hold any loot, and they were still building on top of loot. And the question is, like, what's the incentive to do so? I talked to some people where they think there's very little incentive to build on top of loot because the economic incentives to start a new project are very strong. I think the answer is more along the lines of you need people to feel like they're part of the community. And if the only way to be part of the community is to hold one of 8,000 bags, that's only going to expand so far. If any Adventure Gold holding makes you feel like part of the community, that means that we can build a much, much larger community of builders and players and create a really healthy ecosystem. So I threw governance out there as an idea, mostly because it was a more participatory way to run the ecosystem than like 8,000 NFTs only, when you could have plenty more than with 8,000 holders with Adventure Gold. It's like most cryptocurrencies are basically infinitely divisible, so like you could theoretically have like infinite holders of Adventure Gold. The interesting part is that governance is what people latched onto, and that got very, very contentious. So some people were like, is loot governing loot? Is Adventure Gold governing loot? Which one is it? And then the narrative was that Adventure Gold was a governance token, which, I mean, it was an idea I suggested, but it was never the intention. The primary intention was like a in-game currency that people could use inside of games in the loot ecosystem. So this like narrative kind of formed on crypto Twitter that Adventure Gold was a governance token, and this counter narrative formed that like Adventure Gold is like a vampire attack on the loot ecosystem because it's like trying to take governance power away from loot holders and transfer it to Adventure Gold. And then there was a third narrative that formed, which is that the ecosystem should have no governance and it should be totally permissionless and totally experimental and bottom up, and like that like any governance is a failure. So there were some people who were like Adventure Gold should govern loot. There were some people who said Adventure Gold was a vampire attack on loot. There were some people who said the loot ecosystem should have no governance at all. All of this was like none of this was the original intention of Adventure Gold. So trying to navigate that was very interesting. Like the only reason why Adventure Gold as governance got traction was because people were actually using Adventure Gold for governance. There was a group writing loot lore that was using Adventure Gold to vote on storylines. Like the reason why people were talking about Adventure Gold for governance was because people were using Adventure Gold for governance. So the discussions got very, very contentious, and it got so contentious that there was ultimately the burn the keys vote for loot. So this is where things culminated. There was a bunch of people who were pro Adventure Gold governance. There were a bunch of people who were pro loot governance, and there were a bunch of people who were anti-governance of any kind. And the idea was, okay, let's have a vote to burn the keys. And if you want to sacrifice a treasury of 200 loot bags and the corresponding adventure gold that can be claimed for them, and if you want to sacrifice a treasury and not have that and miss out on some benefits, I think, of governance of, like, for example, like coordinating effort. Like, I know of multiple people working on player versus player battles for loot games. Like, it'd be better for them to coordinate and build one game than to try to all build their own games on their own. Like, governance serves you as structure, but if you want to just completely, like, have no governance at all, have it be completely bottom up, you can vote to burn the keys. And the interesting part is that there was the burn the keys vote, and that vote, I was like one of only a handful of people who voted not to burn the keys. I don't remember the exact conclusion of it, but towards the end it was 98% burn the keys and 2% don't. And this was after another contentious vote that had been conducted, which was, should Adventure Gold govern loot? And that vote was, like, basically split 50-50, which interestingly is pretty much the makeup of Adventure Gold, of loot holders who also held Adventure Gold. About 55% of loot holders held Adventure Gold, and then the split of should Adventure Gold govern loot was, like, also roughly 50-50. So there's this, like, rejection of governance from the community. Like, first, people were split on which one should be the governance token, loot or Adventure Gold, over this, like, treasury of loot bags and the corresponding Adventure Gold. And then the loot community, the loot holders, were just like, okay, burn the keys. Interestingly, so that vote occurred, and then Dom went on honeymoon. Needless to say, no one in the community, Dom, myself, other people involved in the early days, expected this reaction. I think if Dom had expected this, he probably would have like scheduled it differently around the honeymoon. Anyway, so Dom went on honeymoon, is on honeymoon until the end of October, and then at that point, so this is the really interesting thing, and this is the thing that makes me, like, think a ton about governance mindsets and scarcity versus abundance and building long-term ecosystems, is that the burn the keys vote was pretty much, like, nearly universally burn the keys. After the burn the keys vote, which explicitly said in the proposal, if we burn the keys, we won't have a treasury, there is a proposal that Dom put up around how should we think about a treasury. And the burn the keys vote was pretty much universally, like, in favor of burning the keys to sacrifice a treasury. And then the discussion post on the forum about how should we think about a treasury was, like, pretty favorable to the idea of a treasury. And it's like, those two things don't match up. If you vote to burn the keys and not have a treasury, and then you're in favor of a treasury, there's questions in my mind about governance processes and how much the long-term versus short-term implications are being considered.
So, okay, I think that this is absolutely fascinating because, yeah, not only is there that tension there, but, like, what sort of participation level are you getting in these votes? And there seems to be, like, this big difference between saying, hey, we're going to come together, we're going to go make these things. The way that we're going to make decisions is token holders having a vote through something like Snapshot, and there being some sort of focus put on governance. This was such an emergent process that all of a sudden there was sort of a Snapshot stood up. There wasn't even this underlying understanding, I think, for most people, and this idea of governance or governing or decision making. And so to me, Snapshot was used as a way of trying to, I use the word build legitimacy before. But were you getting, like, deep involvement in the governance process, or, like, what sort of percentages were we seeing?
Yeah, it was like a quarter of all loot holders were voting in governance. It was substantial, and that was, or sorry, not a quarter of all loot holders, a quarter of all loot bags. But yeah, like, pretty substantial participation. And yeah, this is the thing that I think a lot about, is that as soon as loot launched, so there were two things that made me realize how scarcity minded the community was. One is that when loot launched, there's this, like, abundance mindset of builders and getting people involved, and how do we create a really strong ecosystem. In the earliest days of Adventure Gold, there was also that mindset. And then at some point, the mindset shifted to a scarcity mindset. And this, I think the turning point was when More Loot launched. So Dom had originally created this thing called synthetic loot. And synthetic loot is essentially, it generated a loot bag for any wallet address. So based on the data on a wallet address, like it would generate a loot bag. And the idea was like, this is a way you can participate in the loot ecosystem and play any future loot games without needing to actually hold any loot. You don't even need any NFT. You don't even need to pay for any gas. You just use synthetic loot. Synthetic loot was out there. It was available. Some people would like post screenshots of like, oh, check out the synthetic loot for like my wallet, and like, ooh, this like I have a divine robe for like this wallet address. Like it was a cool thing that people were working with. And then, but synthetic loot kind of like, just because it wasn't an NFT, like it didn't it didn't gain much uptake. Like there were a bunch of loot derivatives that were literally just like the loot contract, but like, forked to like add more bags total. And there were like a few of these. So Dom was like, okay, I'll make more loot, which is like can be minted and it's like slightly inflationary, but like not super inflationary. It's based on like number of blocks and there's a hard cap, and it was like elegant like inflationary tokenomics. He launched more loot, and the community just that's when he started getting his round of death threats, is the way I'd put it. He got death threats over more loot. The floor price of loot dropped by half, and it was just incredibly negative reaction from OG loot holders to something that was a version of what already existed before. Synthetic loot already existed. More loot was just saying, okay, let's take synthetic loot, the ideas of it, and let's just like make it an NFT because like people really want the idea of an NFT. So like let's give them an NFT. So from the perspective of people deeply involved in the loot ecosystem, More Loot and synthetic loot had similar origins, similar ideals. More Loot just led to this like huge like outcry among OG loot holders. And that was, in my mind, the first sign of the scarcity mindset that had taken hold, because it seemed obvious to me like you can't build a game with 8,000 holders. No one's going to build a game for 8,000 players. And like I think like when you look at the breakdown of loot holders, it's actually like 2,500 or so like holders total of loot. So like you can't build a game for 2,000, 3,000 people. No one's ever going to do that. And you need builders to like be part of the ecosystem and feel like they're fully part of it to want to build on top of loot. The community just rejected that. I think that there's this mindset in a lot of cryptocurrency communities that inflation is bad and deflation is good, and 8,000 loot bags is good and 1,000,000 loot bags is bad. And I think that the scarcity mindset is very short term, because it's very much, how do I preserve the value of my holdings as much as possible? It's not thinking about the builders. It's not thinking about the ecosystem. It's not thinking about a treasury. The burn the keys ecosystem and burn the keys vote to like sacrifice a treasury is a good example of that as well. And that was the sign to me that like the scarcity mindset had taken hold, and the community was thinking a lot about how to preserve the value of their loot bags and not a lot about how to get a lot of builders involved.
Yeah, I really love highlighting that tension, because I think any project that's launching in the space needs to address that in some way. And I think, personally, I believe when we look back on DAOs, community tokens of this era, it's going to look kind of weird that we've done it with sort of fixed token supplies. Like, one of the core issues that exist in the space is, where is the incentive to continue to contribute? And if you get your bag early, your incentive truly is just to preserve the value of that bag, playing these short-term games, versus trying to build networks that have, like when we think about a token model within C Club, I want C Club to be a thing that outlives me, right? That sort of has an infinite time horizon.
That's why your title is Instigator, right? You're the catalyst. You've kicked it off.
Right. I just want to put it out there, but thinking through like, okay, well, does 10 million tokens make sense if we're dealing with 1,000 years? I mean, that maybe sounds like a little ridiculous thing to say, but I think it's probably the time horizons we should be thinking about. So this idea of like inflationary supplies, I think, will be much more popular. But you're right, we come up against the valuation of these things right now by the market is very much based around very simple narratives, very easy to understand narratives. The simpler, the better in many ways. And the scarcity narrative is such a clear one. Like, I wonder, is there lessons in communication, in messaging, in product design that would kind of like help us orient towards more of a long-term view?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the most important things I saw from the Adventure Gold launch, and something that at Syndicate we're helping a lot of DAOs with consulting on, because there are so many useful insights about governance and tokenomics that come from the whole loot and adventure gold journey. And one thing that's fascinating is I coded in seasons just to be done by a DAO vote. Like the DAO could vote to have a new season, and if they wanted to have a new season, then it takes place. Some people have asked me over time, like, what would I have done differently? And the answer is I would have made it inflationary. I would have coded in seasons as a time-based requirement. Every 3 months or 6 months or 12 months, there's a new season. Instead of coding it in as a DAO vote, which I thought was the best option to give the voting power to the community, but when such a scarcity mindset takes hold, it's harder. So I think that one thing that inflation does is inflation aligns the interests of everyone. It aligns the interests of early holders and late holders. For example, like early holders who got loot bags with an adventure gold claim, and late holders who got loot bags after the adventure gold is already claimed. It aligns those interests, and it also aligns the interests of building a long-term ecosystem, because you're not relying on scarcity to drive the dynamics of the community. You're relying on abundance, and how you choose to use that abundance is a really powerful thing. And I think that the reality is that as soon as a project launches, the scarcity mindset by default will take hold. You even saw a criticism of Ethereum for years. It was like that Ethereum was inflationary while Bitcoin was deflationary, so therefore Bitcoin was superior to Ethereum. Like that was a very common argument made from like 2015 all the way through well, you still see that argument being made. So all the way until like 1559, which like started to prove that ETH is deflationary with usage, which is like exactly the dynamic you want in a long-term in an ecosystem thinking about the long term. By the way, that's not like a subtweet of Bitcoin in any way. I think Bitcoin is interesting too. I'm passionate about Bitcoin as a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Whether it's achieved those goals is another question, or whether it's a store of value. But anyway, yeah, I think that if I built in abundance tokenomics from the start, we would have had more of an abundance mindset. And I think loot would have benefited from the same thing. The question is the incredible momentum around loot and the NFT space in general. The NFT space is a FOMO-driven space. You told me about Squiggles back in January and thought, oh wow, $100 for a squiggle? That seems really expensive. And I really missed the boat on that one. And the NFT space is very FOMO driven, and it's very driven by like you get in early and you make it big, and if you don't get in early, you won't make it big. And like you just need one win to make it big. It's kind of like, I'm not gonna say that it sounds like a gambling mentality, but a lot of the dynamics are like reasonably similar. Even down to like minting things feels in a way like gambling. Like, will you get something you like aesthetically? Will you get something rare? I think the like thing that no one really says in the NFT space is that like the current dynamics are mostly gambling dynamics. It's driven by being early. It's driven by FOMO. It's driven by these random mints. Like you couldn't engineer a better system of gambling lottery ideas if you tried. And for NFTs to be useful in the long term, and for these to not look like the 2017 patterns where a bunch of ICOs were super valuable and never recovered, for NFTs to like have long-term enduring value, they will need strong communities, and they will need to have real fundamentals of community members and builders who are pushing the ball forward. Loot is one of the very few communities that has that. There are so many people building the Loot ecosystem. There's dozens of derivatives. There's new projects launching every single day. The quality of the builders is just absolutely incredible. Loot has that. Some other communities have that. A lot of communities don't. And I think that my prediction for the next like 3 years of the NFT market is that the NFT market's dynamics will look very similar to the ICO market's dynamics, where in 2017, something spiked to absolutely insane values and crashed and never recovered. We're seeing that spike. We're seeing similar things like gas wars to get into projects very early. That is very reminiscent of 2017. We're seeing some of the less savory elements of 2017, like teams lying about their backgrounds, lying about who they are, like getting tons of money anyway. We're seeing like people like ape into things just hoping to sell it higher without knowing anything about it. A lot of it feels like 2017. And to avoid the crash of 2017 that occurred, these NFTs need a community and they need builders, and this only comes from an abundance mindset. Most NFTs that are 10,000 profile photo drops fundamentally don't have an abundance mindset. And while a few will be very valuable, I'm sure, most will go to zero. And yeah.
I really love that framing of like so it's like, preserving the value of my thing is a scarcity mindset. But I think you used the language as something around like, how do I invest the abundance or make use of this abundance? And I think that's actually a really helpful way of phrasing it, right? A much more active engagement with value creation. It's like, here are these resources that are being created. And yeah, one way to look at it is like, it's just going to dilute down everything you created. But the only way that's really truly going to be the case is if you're not putting those assets to productive use. And the productive use of those assets really should be core to what your community is trying to build or what your network is trying to build. And so like this idea of building an abundance engine that can be used to drive the future creation of value, like we should be able to get buy-in and interest and excitement behind that. It just feels like a lot more of like an optimistic and exciting. And if one thing I'm very excited about around the narratives, at least this time around within crypto, is how much we value builders, and how much of a badge of honor it is when somebody calls you a builder versus maybe a dirty investor, those dirty VC investors. But if you're a builder, you can do stuff. And so like, I feel like there's narratives here that we can harness to say like, truly we want more community members to be builders. The value that we can co-create here, for community tokens, for DAOs, for social tokens to really work, is we need to be able to leverage the social capital and financial capital these organizations can create to go create more value. And I just know that we're like a really great project and a narrative that takes hold away from, I think, that really being a flag to fly. We're coming up on the hour, and I want to just sort of like wrap this up a little bit, because I love this conversation. It's very winding, and you make me nerd out of a bunch of different things. But I'm very curious, what does the existing loot ecosystem look like? Where are we at with Adventure Gold? Like what is, uncertain today, but going to be more certain, and what do you sort of see for the next few months?
Yeah. I think that there's incredible energy from builders, and there was this rush of projects that launched, and those projects were derivatives that were like very, very heavily inspired by Dom's original contract, mostly changing some of the variables, some of the parameters, and relaunching it. So people saw a bunch of projects launched, and then they saw like derivatives stop launching, and people thought, oh, loot's dead, the builders have moved on. What they didn't realize is that what was still being worked on was the high effort projects. The things that take more than a few days to build were what people were working on. And there was this rush of like very quick copy paste jobs, and then this lull, and a lot of people thought that means people aren't building, but in reality it was people building really, really incredible projects. One of those projects that launched recently was Loot Mart, which is made by an amazing team. A lot of them are at Manifest, which is a fantastic NFT protocol. Some of the artists involved are deep in the GAN space and customize their GANs for Loot Mart. The Loot Mart team, like it took them weeks to run the machine learning algorithms necessary to generate the images. Like it took them weeks of just processing power to make it happen. And the result of Loot Mart is incredible. You can unbundle your loot bag into items. You keep your loot bag, you get the items. So it's like a nice derivative on top. You don't have to custody your loot bag or anything like that. And you can then use those in anything that you wish. And other games can build on top of those items. And Loot Mart does this key thing where it shifts people to an abundance mindset, because now instead of 8,000 loot bags, there's loot for every single item. And you can go acquire an item and do something in the ecosystem. So like it has very cleverly like shown that an abundance mindset can work. And if Loot Mart, for example, or other projects had support for more loot, you have this just like explosion of playable items that people can use, which still preserves and accrues value back to the original loot and Adventure Gold holders. And the derivatives that are being worked on now are just incredible games, incredible tokenomics, amazing detailed art. That is what takes more than a few days to launch. So I think a lot of people saw the explosion in interest in loot and were like, oh, well, there aren't derivatives launching now, even though there were like dozens of derivatives that had already launched. The community must have moved on. In reality, it was people working on the hard stuff. And we're just starting to see that, and we'll see more of that. And it's pretty incredible as we think about how the future of builders and loot looks. The abundance mindset I've seen from builders makes me very optimistic.
I love that. Yeah, big fan of the Manifest team. Good people over there. what is the current status of Adventure Gold? Is this a governance token now? What are we doing with these things?
So it has two roles in the ecosystem. One is that it's back to the original goals of an in-game currency, which I'm very glad about. Adventure Gold has already been used for an NFT swap by the Genesis team. It's already been used for permissioning mints. I'm talking with builders who are discussing using Adventure Gold in their marketplaces. I'm talking with builders who are discussing wagering Adventure Gold to be able to join a battle. So it's an in-game currency, and the momentum I've seen there from builders has been fantastic. The other element of Adventure Gold is if the loot ecosystem decides to go through with burning the keys, it's on Adventure Gold to have an abundance mindset and think about the long term. Because there's this great Adventure Gold tokenomics proposal put together by a number of community members, and like that's one proposal where it would lead to some inflation, and that would both accrue value back to original loot holders, potentially M-loot holders, and also provide a treasury that Adventure Gold can go and give to projects to really build a strong ecosystem. I think that we'll see how the loot burn the keys aspect plays out. We'll see whether loot decides to form a treasury or not. But if loot decides not to, the ball is in Adventure Gold holders' court. And I'm hopeful that Adventure Gold holders will think about the long term, think about how to encourage builders to use Adventure Gold in the ecosystem, as has already been occurring, and not also think about a scarcity mindset.
Absolutely fascinating. I'm sure I have many more questions, and more will come as I think you're still very much in the middle of this sort of emergent world that's happening. I love getting the sort of most recent update on what's happening there, because I think for those of us that are on the not deeply involved in these communities, all you really see is like the hype, like the big pickup and then the drop off, and you don't have a sense of really what's happening underneath. But yeah, without a doubt, great things take time to build, and excited to see what that community brings together. Appreciate you sharing the story. It's a story that I just wanted to capture because I think it's such it's emblematic of so many great things within crypto. How it just sort of, it was a crazy idea and then it becomes a thing. And so much of the excitement, I think, of working in the space really, leans into that idea, right? Like we can be a part of these things, and there's a roller coaster ride that can go along with everything. And sitting at the front of that roller coaster sometimes can be a little bit more of a whiplash, I think, and glad that you've weathered that well. Yeah, really appreciate you sharing the story. I've appreciated your collaboration over the last few months and look forward to many more. And I wish you, just the best in this. And I feel like there's a whole other line of questioning that I'm going to get into with you some other time around the contracts that you've built for Adventure Gold, because I think that's maybe the other thing here where, if Adventure Gold hadn't gone on to be this really big thing that sort of sucks so much oxygen out of the room, my guess is that you would be launching multiple tokens on the backs of NFTs using the contract that you used to launch Adventure Gold, because in there is an interesting primitive that you're working with, right? Which is like, for NFT collections, would it be useful to have an ERC20 associated with that and claimable by people who hold that? And specifically, as I think about how we launch tokens around SquigglesDAO, the ability for Squiggle hold, like there's something really interesting there in that dynamic that I think has a lot of room to explore.
I agree, and I think that's where we can do a part 2 at some point on the Adventure Gold tokenomics and lessons for other NFT projects. I think that the short version is that's why getting the tokenomics right up front is so important. Adventure Gold, I think, hit on tokenomics that aligned well with the general community, but I think that like those tokenomics can be tuned even more finely. And thinking about how to expand this idea of attaching social tokens to other communities, to other NFT projects. I've been talking with a bunch about their goals and figuring out what they're interested in, figure out how to come up with a set of best practices for tokenomics in the space. So that's what I've been spending a lot of time on at Syndicate, is helping projects with tokenomics. And I would love to do a part 2 to dive into that at some point in the future.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll bring the goods to people at some point, but before that, you and I need to chat about that, because there's a number of things we're working on that I would love to get your opinion on. I know I've threatened to send you stuff in the past, but I need to make sure I follow up on that right now. We have some fun things cooking at C Club. All right, we're going to leave it there. We'll appreciate your time and all that you've done, and stoked to chat with you again in the hopefully not so distant future.
Thanks so much.
Oh, wait. Where can people find you on the internet? I have to do this. This is a podcast thing. I need to make sure that you get people flooding your DMs with positive notes.
Hopefully compliments, not death threats. Yeah. On Twitter, I am at Will Papper, at Will and then Papper, like paper with an extra P. You can find me there. And I talk a lot about the loot ecosystem on Twitter. I talk a lot about governance, tokenomics. So if you're just that stuff, come hang out.
Awesome. Yeah, check out Will on Twitter and also Syndicate Protocol. You do have a day job, don't you, Will?
Yep, syndicate.io. Yeah. And if you need to reach me for anything syndicate related, Will at syndicate.io.
Amazing. All right, we can leave it there. I'm getting better at this podcast thing, Will. I'm going to have it all down by episode 100 and feel just completely natural.
Oh, this is fantastic. Yeah. It's one of the best conversations I've had so far.
Awesome, man. I appreciate that. All right, we'll leave it there. Have a good one.
Talk later, Jess.